Hooray for bombs! Hooray for bombs! Hooray for bombs! Hooray for bombs! Everyone in the world is still talking, writes Caleb Howe at Red State, and thinking and planning about Donald Trump and the U.S. military sending missiles downrange and blowing up a Syrian airbase recently. In American politics, we hear the phrase, the whole world is watching, all the time, because we think everyone everywhere is hanging on every little exchange of fortunes in D.C. It's silly sometimes, but not this time. This time, the whole world is watching. Former ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, has been shopping a new tagline lately as super notes at the Right Scoop, and it's a good one. The Obama era of American foreign policy is clearly over. As Bolton explains to Sean Hannity's audience, those missiles hit more than an airbase. They struck a note, rang a bell, raised a flag. You know, kind of like Lex Luthor at the end of Batman Superman Dawn of Justice. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. The bell cannot be unrung. The bell cannot be unrung. What's the message? Things are different now. They don't have to be hugely different or hugely different for that message to have a huge impact. Trump's base is caterwauling about globalism and perpetual war in the Middle East and all their other peacenik isolationist bellyaches. But the low-casualty, high-impact strike isn't exactly a nuke. It was, as Bolton notes, measured. An explosive force to shake the ground, if not the earth. But as a change from the Obama era, the seismic reading is off the scale. And it was not wanton. They broke their agreement. They used chemical weapons. They were held accountable. See? Different. Maybe that's the smart power we've heard about for all these years. And it matters. Even if the nutwhacks who comprise a large and incredibly vocal part of Trump's base and who have his ear get their way and he retreats to the fig leaf of anti-globalism as an excuse for weakness, we have still gained from just these particular 59 wake-up calls a reminder that we still have and can use devastating force, that nobody could stop us from doing it or punish for having done it. And perhaps a hint that maybe there's a bit of unpredictable crazy eyes on the button at the White House. And everyone knows you don't mess with crazy. Or as Senator Graham put it recently, well, I can't say that on the air. But instilling worry is good too. Not to mention the idea of actions having consequences. It's enormously important because we know that North Korea's nuclear weapons program was right at the top of the agenda in the U.S.-China bilateral meetings. And what Trump basically said is when a country like Syria undertakes solemn commitments in the Chemical Weapons Convention and the famous John Kerry deal that we thought eliminated, or at least the Obama administration claimed eliminated Syria's chemical weapons, when countries violate those commitments, there are going to be consequences. That's Bolton again. Of course, the world is complicated and is more complex than just we waved our gun, but again, the point he is addressing is more than valid. this is not the Obama era anymore. Whoever it was in the Trump administration that crafted this policy, if it can be called that, who put this first move on the board, they accomplished that. Whoever it is that told him to do it, whoever it was. And don't give me hell for suggesting it wasn't the Donald. His own minions and legions are crying from the rooftops that he was duped by globalist deep space establishment. Oh! His own fans, his own followers. I've seen it. They think it. Just like they say he was tricked and deceived into endorsing that House Trump Care bill. So don't fault me for believing his believers. I'm just saying that whatever voice manipulated Donald Trump into doing this, good for them, whoever they are. In the long run, it's a good thing. Here's something I said on the day that the Tomahawk missile strike in Syria was unleashed. Donald Trump may just have been wagging the dog a little bit in a good cause. Trump needed something positive to give his first 100 days in office a kick, and the Tomahawk strike against a Syrian airbase may have been just the ticket, writes Susan Wright at Red State. CBS News released a new poll, and it shows that a majority of Americans polled are on board with making a decisive stand against Bashar al-Assad's attack on his own people. According to the poll, 57% of Americans approve of the airstrike against Syrian military targets, calling immoral the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons that led to the strike. But most are leery of any military involvement beyond airstrikes, as CBS News poll shows. End of quote. Now, because of the strike, Trump's anemic ratings saw a bump as well. His approval rating now stands in the CBS News New York Times poll at 43%, with 49% disapproving. While Trumplican, or conservative approval held to about the same level, it was independents, as it always is, who gave him the boost, approving at 42% as opposed to 34% before the strike. Further, only 18% would support military action that put American boots on the ground in Syria. Like anybody believes that's going to happen. Breaking it down along party lines, about half of Republicans polled would prefer to keep any further action limited to airstrikes or diplomacy, which means it will be totally ineffective. Democrats, on the other hand, would prefer to keep it limited to diplomacy only, which would be even more ineffective. Some things you can't talk your way out of, and you can only hit so many aspirin factories before it becomes costly to Americans financially and reputation-wise. There is still some concern about the president's ability to handle the Syria situation going forward. Nearly 8 in 10 Republicans express confidence in Trump and on that, while most Democrats do not. Independents are more uneasy about the handling going forward, even as they are approving of the strike last week. In other words, so far, so good, I guess. Which is another way of saying it made a big noise, it looked cool, and there were no American casualties. Most Americans like that combination. So when there's a price to be paid, that they get squeamish. The strike also served to lower the percentage of Americans who saw Trump as being too friendly with Russia. I said this the day of the attack, since Russia has stepped forward and condemned the strike. Again, it was independents who fueled that change. So, military strikes, usually a good thing, as long as they're short, devastating, and cost-free. It just goes to show how easy it is to make our enemies look weak and impotent, which is a novelty after 8 years of Barack Hussein Obama. As Streif wrote at Red State, as might be expected, Russia and Iran retaliated against the United States missile strike on a Syrian airbase with a bit of bluster. It's a quote from ABC News. A statement released by the Joint Command Operations Center of Syrian Allies, or JCOCASA, a group that includes Russia and Iran, oh, let's be honest, it is Russia and Iran, warned the United States against further military actions in the war-torn country following a missile strike on a Syrian airbase last week. Referring to its defense of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad's regime, the group warned that they would support Syria and its people with all means that we have, while they're driving them out by the millions and exterminating them by the hundreds of thousands. I added that last part. The United States crossed red lines. There's some gimmick infringement for you. Original. By attacking Syria. From now on, we will respond to anyone, including America, if it attacks Syria and crosses the red lines, the statement read. America knows very well our ability and capabilities to respond well to them, and we will respond without taking into consideration any reaction or consequences. If they really meant that, they'd actually be responding with more than bluster now, wouldn't they? The statement did not include, surprise, surprise, or as Gomer Pyle would have put it, surprise, 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 any critical details like what kind of military operation would cross such a red line, or what kind of response would be made on the part of Syria and its allies, but noted that they would work to liberate Syria from occupation. Rest assured, definitely not Russian occupation. Rest assured that we will liberate Syria from all kinds of occupying forces except our own. It does not matter from where they came. It doesn't matter from where they came. Yes, yeah, I bet you never thought you'd hear a Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson catchphrase in a foreign policy video, but hey, we're diverse. It doesn't matter from where they came to the occupied part of Syria, the statement warned. Not Russian occupied. Russia and Iran will not allow the United States to be the only superpower in the world, close quote. Translation, and summed up in a nutshell. It's not fair! It's not fair! Either that or, uh-oh, the window of opportunity just slammed shut. See, there are a lot of threads running through this statement. As the ABC story notes, the Russians and the Iranians, don't bother saying what the red line is. We can suspect that it is not the use of chemical weapons, as Russia is getting beaten badly on their complicity in the attack, and they voted in favor of the 2013 UN Security Council resolution that demanded Syria give up its chemical weapons. The fact is that retaliating against the United States on the Syrian theater is something Russia is not going to do. It might take a defensive action against another U.S. strike, something it didn't even attempt on this last time, but it is not going to strike back later. And the reason is simple. Russia is able to supply its forces in Syria because they are allowed to. If Turkey closes its airspace to Russian military flights, it is pretty much game over for the Russians in Syria. Beyond that, it is doubtful if the Russian air defense systems in Syria can defend against Tomahawk attacks, and its fighters and pilots are no match for any non-Arab air force in the region. Iran, however, is a different set of facts. They were behind the bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983. They were behind the bombing of Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia in 1996. It is well within their ability to strike against U.S. military forces on the ground in Syria, assisting in the fight against ISIS. In fact, we might be able to put this in the guaranteed column. The other thing that struck me about the announcement was the vociferous loyalty pledged to Syria. Over the weekend, the Trump foreign policy team was consistent in asking Russia why it wanted to be affiliated with Syria. Here's a quote from thehill.com. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said in an interview that the U.S. missile strike was intended to send a message to Russia. The entire administration was in agreement that this was something that had to be done. This was something that needed to tell Assad enough is enough, Haley told NBC's Press the Meat. And this is something to let Russia know. You know what? We're not going to have you cover for this regime anymore. And we're not going to allow things like this to happen to innocent people. Haley said the U.S. took a more moderate approach, but it is capable of doing much more. She criticized Russia, saying its response to the chemical attack was to defend the Syrian government. The U.S. is not going to allow Russia to have Assad's back anymore, she said. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said on Sunday that he hopes Russia will be supportive of a process that will lead to a stable Syria. I'm disappointed because I think the real failure here has been Russia's failure to live up to its commitments under the chemical weapons agreements that were entered into in 2013, Tillerson said during an interview on ABC's This Week. He attributed the chemical attack in Syria in large measure to a failure on Russia's part to achieve its commitment to the international community. I hope Russia is thinking carefully about its continued alliance with Bashar al-Assad, he said, because every time one of those horrific attacks occurs, it draws Russia closer into some level of responsibility. And then National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster also questioned what the Russians want the relationship with the United States to look like. Do they want it to be a relationship of competition and potential conflict? I don't see how that's in Russia's interests. Or do they want it to be a relationship in which we can find areas of cooperation that are in mutual interest, McMaster asked. How is it in anyone's interest that this conflict in Syria and this catastrophe in the greater Middle East continues? End of quote. In other words, using more of the statecraft toolbox. Diplomacy is one tool, absolutely. So is military force, so are economic sanctions, so are more coercive tools to back up that diplomacy and give it credibility. Now, over time, I've discovered the easiest way to tell a man is thinking about cheating on his wife or has basically decided to leave his wife is when he declares out of the blue how wonderful his wife is and how great their marriage is. You're sitting there, and out of the blue, in the middle of a discussion about the foot-pounds impact of the NATO 5.56 millimeter round at 800 meters per second, Chuck starts talking about how great the little woman is. When that happens, you know his marriage is in its final stages. There was a bit of that in this declaration, and when you combine it with the failure to spell out what red line was being discussed, you take away an impression that Russia and Iran are not of one accord, and that Russia might possibly be looking around for the exit. In short, as long as Vladimir Putin was being given a free hand in Syria, it was worth it for them to occupy the country and prop up Bashar Assad. If there's going to start being some cost to it, Vlad just may cut his losses. As a matter of fact, Arthur Herman at National Review thinks that Trump's Syria missile strike could transform the Middle East if we play our cards right. See, there's an emerging Israeli-Sunni alliance against the Damascus-Tehran axis, and the United States needs to lead it. Now, call it the Tomahawk strike heard round the world, not just in Washington and Damascus and Moscow, but in every capital in the Middle East. By ordering the strike on al-Shayrat airfield, from which Bashar al-Assad had launched a brutal chemical weapons attack on his own people just days earlier, Donald Trump put the United States squarely back in the game of Middle East politics. But without further action, it will have been for naught. What must come next is a new regional strategy for the United States that is very different from the one adopted by Barack Hussein Obama. One that backs up diplomatic coalition building with U.S. military strength. What did I just say in the last segment? Use all the tools in the statecraft toolbox. In 1990 and 91, President George H.W. Bush used such a strategy to drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait during Operation Desert Storm. Today, the United States is once again perfectly positioned to bring together the region's leading Sunni powers and Israel in an alliance against Iran and its Shia allies, who are the real geopolitical threat in Syria. Now, who would be part of this alliance? Israel and Saudi Arabia, the region's most powerful Sunni state, have been drawing closer for the past decade, united by their shared interest in counteracting Iranian regional aggression, as have the other majority Sunni Gulf states. Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, and Oman could also become strong strategic partners in a U.S.-led coalition designed to thwart Iran's ongoing efforts to trigger a regional Shia uprising from Syria and/or Yemen. This new alliance would have two prongs and two aims. The first would be to permanently end Tehran's designs on becoming a regional hegemon, especially in the eastern Mediterranean, where it is propping up the Assad regime in Syria and sponsoring terrorist groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon. The second aim would be to crush ISIS wherever it holds territory, from Syria and the Sinai to Iraq, as well as to extirpate Sunni radicalism in all its forms. Here, the U.S. would have to make it clear to the Saudis and other Gulf states that ISIS, like al-Qaeda, must be destroyed, both on the ground abroad and in the domestic madrasas and mosques that spread its vicious radical message. That, of course, leaves Russia. Fortunately, Assad's renewed use of chemical weapons put Vladimir Putin at a disadvantage, since Russia almost certainly knew of the chemical strike and may even have facilitated it. The Kremlin certainly lied when it assured the world that the regime's stockpile of chemical weapons had been dealt with. When Secretary of State Tillerson meets with Putin this week, he needs to take advantage of that weakness and stress to Moscow that its support for Assad is now a liability, not an asset. The Russians have already signaled that their support for Damascus is not unconditional, quote-unquote. Their entire raison d'etre for intervention in the Syrian conflict is combating terrorism. Now they must acknowledge that Assad and his Iranian allies are no less terrorists than ISIS and should be dealt with accordingly. Now, far more is at stake here than removing a brutal dictator. Preventing his Iranian patrons from becoming a dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean is just as important, if not more. The final goal of Trump's strategy in the Middle East has to be convincing Putin that his support for and collaboration with Iran is a liability rather than an asset, and that siding with the emerging U.S. Sunni-Israeli coalition is the best way for Russia to demonstrate a good faith commitment to fighting terrorism and playing a constructive role in the region. All of that set in motion with 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles, ladies and gentlemen. The region's Sunni powers realize the potency of the Iranian threat, as does Israel. The Obama administration pretended the Iran problem would go away on its own if we sat on our hands with our thumbs up our butts. The Trump administration now has an opportunity to reverse that course, enlisting a coalition of Sunni partners in the complicated task of isolating and limiting Iran's power to revise the geopolitical order in the eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. In closing, it should be stressed that none of these strategic shifts need involve placing more American troops on the ground in the Middle East. Maybe. The team is already on the field. All that's been missing is a quarterback. For the United States to fulfill that role, it merely needs a leader willing to reassert the influence that Obama would not, and that George W. Bush before him squandered by not attacking Syria and Iran and cleaning out the Arab Crescent. Our natural allies in the region have been clamoring for help from Washington for years. Donald Trump now has the opportunity to provide it. But will he? And yes, the Russians knew of the Syrian, which is to say Bashar al-Assad's, chemical attack in advance. They knew about it. Via the Associated Press, quote, the United States has concluded Russia knew in advance of Syria's chemical weapons attack, a senior U.S. official said Monday. The official said a drone operated by Russians was flying over a hospital as victims of the attack were rushing to get treatment. Hours after the drone left, a Russian-made fighter jet bombed the hospital in what American officials believe was an attempt to cover up the use of chemical weapons. The official said the presence of the surveillance drone over the hospital could not have been a coincidence, and that Russia must have known the chemical weapons attack was coming and that victims were seeking treatment. In other words, the Syrians attacked their own civilians, the Syrian government, with chemical weapons, and then the Russians bombed the hospital where the victims were going to get treatment. Nice, huh? The official, who wasn't authorized to speak publicly on intelligence matters and demanded anonymity, didn't give precise timing for when the drone was above the northern Syrian town of Khan Sheikhtoun, where more than 80 people were killed. He also did not provide all the details for the military and intelligence information that formed the basis of what he said the Pentagon, or Trumpagon, has now concluded. The allegation is grave even by the standards of the current dismal U.S.-Russian relations. Now, this was hinted at the previous week. Here's a quote from NBCnews.com. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, the previous Thursday, had tough words for Russia ahead of a visit to Moscow for official talks next week. In a briefing after the U.S. missile strikes on a Syrian airbase, Tillerson said that Russia had either been complicit or simply incompetent in its failure to deliver on a 2013 commitment to ensure that Syria got rid of its chemical weapons stockpile. Close quote. The allegation is serious, and depending upon what it means, because I'm not sure what it means, it could create an international crisis. When the article says Russia, it implies, at least to me, that Putin and his inner circle were in the decision-making process. If that is true, then one has to conclude that our relations with Russia are ruptured in a major way, because any negotiation you have with them is colored by the fact that they consciously decided to sign off on the use of chemical weapons on a civilian target. War crimes, anyone? This makes them not only moral monsters, no one is surprised about that, but it makes them international scofflaws, outlaws, pariahs. Alternatively, it could mean the Russian military command in Syria. Again, this would be very serious, as it would carry the implication that Russian facilities and equipment would also be subject to destruction. It would also make cooperating with the Russians to ensure that U.S. forces and Russian forces don't end up in conflict, correspondingly more difficult. Or it could mean that the Russians at the airfield in question helped with the attack. If this is the case, the Russians really need to explain how this unit went rogue. But does anybody think that's a very likely option? I'm still not quite sure about Secretary of Defense, James Mattis. But you gotta like his style. You really do. As Streif illustrated at Red State, Mattis destroyed a slew of Syrian missile strike hot takes and offered Bashar al-Assad some very good advice. After the cruise missile attack on a Syrian airfield recently, the left and parts of the GOP set about criticizing the attack and, in essence, claiming it was a botched exercise. I don't think so. See, the big issue came when Syrian fighters used the runway the next day as cameras rolled. As I pointed out on Friday, the runway is the least valuable target if you were trying to destroy an airbase. Well, Secretary of Defense James Mattis released a statement on the cruise missile strike a few days later. Quote, the U.S. military strike against Shayrat airfield on April 6th was a measured response to the Syrian government's use of chemical weapons. The president directed this action to deter future use of chemical weapons and to show the United States will not passively stand by while Assad murders innocent people with chemical weapons, which are prohibited by international law and were declared destroyed. The assessment of the Department of Defense is that the strike resulted in the damage or destruction of fuel and ammunition sites, air defense capabilities, and 20% of Syria's operational aircraft. A fifth of their air force in one strike. That's pretty damn good right there. That's efficiency for you, man. The Syrian government has lost the ability to refuel or rearm aircraft at Shayrat airfield, and at this point, use of the runway is of idle military interest. The Syrian government would be ill-advised ever again to use chemical weapons. In other words, they took out the infrastructure. I mean, it doesn't, if you got a runway, or if you quickly restore a runway, it doesn't really matter if you don't have planes to use it, or if what planes you do have aren't able to be repaired or refueled. Infrastructure, my friends. That last line is Mattis magic. Key points. 20% of Syria's operational aircraft were taken out in one mid-sized attack. This sends the message that the U.S. could take the Syrian Air Force completely out of action pretty much anytime we want. Mattis reiterates that random aircraft using the runway is a meaningless metric. It is the supporting systems around the airfield, the infrastructure, that matter. If the chemical weapons are used again, expect another strike. I really hope John McCain is happy now that someone who knows his business has told him that cratering runways is a meaningless feel-good exercise. Again, you want to shut it down, or you just want something that looks good? On Tuesday of last week, the Trump White House came right out and blamed Russia for trying to cover up the Syrian gas attack. The White House conducted a background briefing with reporters, or 4 reporters, on what is known about the gas attack carried out by the Syrian Air Force against a civilian target on April 4th. The briefing had 4 main points and 1 ancillary one. The ancillary point was to give people who should know better and some who don't the opportunity to quote Tommy Christopher as an authority. Quote from PalmerReport.com. The Associated Press confirmed what Palmer Report had first posited days ago, that Russia was behind the chemical gas attack in Syria. Shortly thereafter, Donald Trump's White House panicked and pulled the plug on what was supposed to have been a background briefing on Russia. Cher Blue caught the switch up this afternoon when it noticed the New York Daily News had reported that the White House briefing was switched from on-the-record background to fully off-the-record just as it was beginning. Share Blue reporter Tommy Christopher characterized the matter thusly. As someone who worked as a White House reporter for 7 years, beginning a briefing on background and changing it to an off-the-record is something I have never heard of. So what exactly is Trump's White House suddenly trying to cover up? End of quote. Well, the mind boggles, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, back to the briefing. You can read it in this tweet, which my eyes don't work nearly that well. But here are the high points. No doubt it was sarin gas. Intel shows Syrians known to be affiliated with the Syrian chemical weapons program at the airbase the day after the attack. Or were there. Video of the victims shows they were exhibiting symptoms of sarin, the nerve gas, folks. Biological samples show it was sarin. The Russians are trying to cover up the attack. The Russians first said the gas was released after a bomb hit a rebel munitions depot. Imagery of the actual expended weapon shows it in the middle of a street. And of course, now Putin is claiming it was a false flag attack. He knows his audience. Trumpers, that is. Which sort of torpedoes this explanation. The briefing document asks, we do think that it's a question worth asking the Russians about how is it possible that their forces were co-located with the Syrian forces that prepared and carried out the chemical weapons attack and did not have foreknowledge. What is noticeable is that any mention of Russia knowing in advance is absent. Make of that what you will. Syria had a reason for the attack. The rebels were threatening the airfield. Syria did not have adequate forces to shore up that area and used a chemical strike to even the odds. Tactical reason for the attack. And there may be more chemical attacks, which means there'll be more and bigger missile strikes against Syrian targets. Briefing noted that there have been over 200 reported incidents of chemical weapon usage since the red line was crossed in 2013. The main thrust of the briefing seems to get in front of Russian disinformation on the attack, which Trumpers just swallow hook, line, and sinker. By releasing an official narrative, there is at least competition on social media for the nonsense being spun by Moscow and its fellow travelers, the megamaniacs. But see, anything that Donald Trump does, you have to throw in the caveat, okay, what's next? Because Trump is shallow as the kiddie pool at Munchkin Land. He's not a thinker. He's not a strategizer. He's not well read. He has a short attention span. I mean, ADHD, Asperger's, all put together, rolled into one. And so you have to ask, as Jonah Goldberg asked in a syndicated column last week, Trump's message is that America is back. But back to do what? Last week on Fox News' special report, syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer suggested that the message behind Donald Trump's military retaliation for Syria's use of chemical weapons is twofold. It's not that there's a new sheriff in town, he explained, but that there is a sheriff at all. Krauthammer's point, echoed by numerous conservatives, is that Barack Obama's obsessive pursuit of a nuclear sellout to Iran, combined with his instinct to lead from behind, created a leadership vacuum around the world. The mother of all leadership vacuums, actually. North Korea, Red China, Russia, and of course Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad all pressed their advantages based on the assumption that America wouldn't really do anything. And they were right. The Syrian strike sends the message that, in Krauthammer's words, America is back. And I'm inclined to agree. But back to what? If I may extend Krauthammer's metaphor a bit, A staple of nearly every Western with a new sheriff in town is the nefarious saloon full of scoundrels and women of easy virtue. The new lawman comes in and fires a warning shot in the air. The piano player pauses, the bartender freezes, and the sheriff says, well, that's just it, isn't it? Trump got everyone's attention with those 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles, but he doesn't seem interested in telling us how to interpret them. His pre-strike comments at the Rose Garden amounted to a kind of bleeding heart interventionism, bemoaning the death of babies, beautiful babies. That's Ivanka's influence right there. His formal statement after the strike was a bit more disciplined, citing our national security interest to thwart the use of chemical weapons. But again, he mentioned those beautiful babies. And that's about it. That's the extent of the Trump doctrine. Trump really hasn't talked about the strike. His weekly address on Saturday only offered this clue, quote, "Our decisions will be guided by our values and our goals, and we will reject the path of inflexible ideology that too often leads to unintended consequences." Just like incoherence doesn't lead to unintended consequences. I mean, didn't he contradict himself in that statement? On the one hand, our decisions will be guided by our values and our goals, but on the other hand, we will reject the path of inflexible ideology that too often leads to unintended consequences. So which is it? Total chaos and incoherence. Welcome to the mind of Donald Trump. All right, and Goldberg says it. You know, he echoes me right here, or I'm echoing him, as the case may be. For what it's worth, ad hoc decisions can have unintended consequences too. Now, needless to say, because everyone else has already said it, this is all in stark contrast to the kind of America First, Code Pink, isolationist insanity presidency that we were promised. That's why some of Trump's harshest critics are almost giddy and some of his most loyal supporters are crestfallen. His surrogates haven't entirely cleared things up. Over the weekend on CNN, our ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said that regime change in Syria was inevitable and that more strikes may be in the cards. On CBS, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson insisted that our Syria policy hasn't changed. And on ABC, he disclosed that we've actually coordinated somewhat with the regime we want to change in order to fight the Islamic State. On Monday, Tillerson said at an event in Italy, quote, "We rededicate ourselves to holding to account any and all who commit crimes against the innocents anywhere in the world." Well, taken literally, that would make America the global sheriff. Now, I feel like I'm watching a Fellini movie without subtitles. I have no idea what's going on, which is, of course, the way Trump prefers it. I'm hardly alone. According to Politico, the White House communications director told his staff, quote, "There is no Trump doctrine," close quote, on foreign policy, which apparently came as a surprise to the campaign veterans who took that America First shit literally and seriously. You got took. It's like I told you, people, coming up on 2 years ago. Ever since then, I've been telling you, people, you didn't want to listen. It's just in this case, it's a good thing. The prominent foreign policy hawk Max Boot writes in Commentary magazine that, quote, "It is incumbent on Trump now to explain why he has changed his mind and what this portends for future U.S. policy." Yeah, I'll be waiting a long time for that. Now, Goldberg is actually not so sure. Trump often boasts that he's unpredictable. Unpredictability can be dangerous. particularly for our allies. But in this case, all the right parties, Russia, Syria, Red China, North Korea, got the right message. Watch it. Why spoil the high note with a lot of explanation? Moreover, what good would it do? Even if Trump gave a foreign policy address detailing some hastily manufactured Trump doctrine, which cannot help but have salacious undertones, this strike alone proves what we've known all along. He is the master of chaos. Events will ultimately clarify the true meaning, intended or not, of the new sheriff's warning shot. Until then, Trump is happy to chalk up a win and move on, which is really all he cares about. Now, Mark Levin is one of those conservatives who, as long as he's pointed in the right direction, he's awesome. He just rips, he takes no prisoners, rips his targets from rectum to belly button. When he's not pointed in the right direction, he can do a lot of fratricidal damage. But on this topic, he's spot on because his target was the MAGA maniacs. Here's the headline of Chris Pandolfo's piece at Conservative Review. The National Socialists trashing Trump on Syria all sound like Code Pink. In other words, his own core supporters. During Tuesday evening's radio program, Conservative Review editor-in-chief Mark Levin remarked on how Donald Trump, like President Reagan before him, has displayed a strength of resolve that has put America's enemies on notice. Over the weekend, as I was thinking about Trump ordering the attack on that airbase in Syria, the point is he showed Putin, he showed Xi Jinping, the Chinese dictator, he showed the Islamo-Nazi in Tehran that things have now changed, Levin said. Not by rhetoric, but by the only thing that matters, action. Now, Levin addressed Trump's critics, those who claim that Trump is adopting a neocon foreign policy of radical interventionism and unconstitutional wars. And as we covered last week, the Syrian strikes were entirely constitutional. The President of the United States has the power to launch such attacks. This goes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson, for crying out loud. Remember Thomas Jefferson and the Barbary pirates? He didn't go to Congress and ask permission to defend the American ships on the sea lanes. He just ordered military action necessary to accomplish that end. This has nothing to do with neoconservatism, Levin said, which, for the record, neoconservatives are liberals who have been mugged by reality and have become conservatives. That's what neoconservatism is. This is reality, Levin said. This is to make sure not only America is first, but Americans are protected. Fight them over there, not over here. To hear people sound like Code Pink while they're saying Make America Great Again, MAGA, while trashing their own country is really frustrating to me. Although it's humorous to me because these people are so completely, the further we get into Trump's term, the worse these people look at any number of different fronts. It's hilarious. As I get to say, I told you so many times. And finally, some historical perspective. And where else to go to get some historical perspective than Professor Victor Davis Hanson at National Review. Barack Obama is America's version of Stanley Baldwin. Both leaders put their successors in a dangerous geopolitical position. Last year, Barack Obama assured the world that we are living in the most peaceful, prosperous, and progressive era in human history, and that the world has never been less violent. Translated, those statements meant that active foreign policy volcanoes in Red China, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and the Middle East would probably not blow up on what little was left of Obama's watch. Obama is the U.S. version of Stanley Baldwin, the suave three-time British Prime Minister of the 20s and 30s. Baldwin's last tenure, from 1935 to 1937, coincided with the rapid rise of aggressive German, Italian, and Japanese fascism. Baldwin was a passionate spokesman for disarmament. He helped organize peace conferences. He tirelessly lectured on the need for pacifism. He basked in the praise of his good intentions. Baldwin assured fascists that he was not rearming Britain. Instead, he preached that the deadly new weapons of the 20th century made war so unthinkable that it would be almost impossible for it to break out. Baldwin left office when the world was still relatively quiet, but his appeasement and pacifism had sown the seeds for a global conflagration soon to come. Obama, the Nobel Peace Laureate and former president, never get tired of saying that, resembles Baldwin. Both seem to believe that war breaks out only because of misunderstandings that reflect honest differences. Therefore, between aggressors and their target remedied by more talk, international agreements, goodwill, and, more than anything else, concessions. Ideas such as strategic deterrence were apparently considered by both Baldwin and Obama to be Neanderthal, judging from Baldwin's naive efforts to ask Hitler not to rearm or annex territory, and Obama's lead from behind foreign policy and his pledge never to do stupid shit abroad. Aggressors clearly assumed that Obama's assurances were green lights to further their own agendas without consequences. Iran routinely threatened U.S. Navy ships, even capturing 10 American sailors early last year. Obama issued various empty deadlines to Iran to cease enriching uranium before concluding a 2015 sellout that gifted the Iranians nuclear weapons. Iran was freed from crippling economic sanctions, and Iran quietly received $400 million in cool, hard cash in the dead of night for the release of American hostages. A ransom, in other words. All that can be said about the Iran nuclear sellout is that Obama's concessions likely ensured he would leave office with a nuclear Iran, soon to get nuclear weapons on someone else's watch. Obama greenlit the Syrian disaster by issuing a red light over the use of chemical weapons and then not enforcing it. The Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad called Obama's bluff. Obama did nothing other than cede Syria to the Russians, begging Vladimir Putin to beg Assad to stop killing civilians with chemical weapons. Nearly 5 years after Obama issued his 2012 red line in Syria, and roughly 500,000 dead later, Assad remains in power. Some 2 million Middle East refugees have overrun Europe, and Assad is still gassing his own citizens with the very chemical agents that the Obama administration had boasted were removed with Russian and Iranian complicity. Obama's reset policy with Russia advanced the idea that George W. Bush had unduly polarized Putin by overreacting to Russian aggression in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. But Obama's concessions and promises to be flexible helped turn a wary but opportunistic Putin into a bold aggressor, assured that he would never have to account for his belligerence. Middle Eastern terrorism? Obama assured us that Al-Qaeda was on the run, and that the Islamic State was a JV organization. His policy of dismissing the phrase Islamic fundamentalism, along with his administration's weird assertions that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was largely secular, and that jihad did not mean using force to spread Islam, earned the U.S. contempt instead of support. Russia and Red China launched cyber attacks on the United States without worry of consequences. Both countries increased their defense budgets while ours collapsed. Red China built artificial island bases in the South China Sea to intimidate its neighbors, while Russia annexed Crimea. North Korea built more and better missiles. Almost weekly, it threatened its neighbors and crowed that it would soon nuke its critics, the American West Coast, where I live, included. You begin to see why we're going to have to use our what remains of our military strength in order to kind of regain the credibility that Barack Obama forfeited in terms of deterrence. If your enemies no longer think you'll use force, then you'll have to use force to convince them that, okay, there is a new sheriff in town. In other words, as was true of Europe between 1933 and 1939, the world grew more dangerous and reached the brink of war. And like Stanley Baldwin, Obama was never willing to make a few unpopular decisions to rearm and face down aggressors in order not to be forced to make far more dangerous and unpopular decisions later on. I guarantee you Trump hasn't thought all this through. That's why it's good that he's got Mattis and McMaster around. I'm still not too sure about Tillerson. Baldwin was popular when he left office, largely because he had proclaimed peace, and he had helped set the table for the inevitable conflict to be inherited by his successors, Neville Chamberlain, who was just like Baldwin, and Winston Churchill, who was not. Obama likewise ignored rumbling volcanoes. He fueled them. And now they are erupting on his successor's watch. In both cases, history was kind, undeservedly, while Baldwin and Obama were in office, but not so after they left. This is what you MAGA maniacs have to understand. It's now to Trump to clean up Obama's messes. And the only way to do that is with a bang.